The silence surrounding this case no longer feels accidental. You know, when Nancy Guthrie first disappeared, most people naturally focused on the obvious details. An elderly woman taken from her home in the middle of the night, a masked suspect captured on surveillance footage, blood evidence at the front door.
Some cases feel different from the very beginning. Not louder, not more dramatic, just different, like something underneath the surface is moving in a direction that doesn't quite match what everyone is being shown on top. The Nancy Guthrie case has felt that way since the first night her name appeared on a screen. And for months now, one question has quietly followed this investigation everywhere it goes. Not the obvious questions, not the ones being debated in comment sections or picked apart in online forums. A quieter one, a more uncomfortable one. What if the answer was never hidden? What if it was right there, in the very first moments of this case, and the people tasked with finding it simply didn't hear what they were actually listening to? That possibility is not a theory pulled from thin air. It is rooted in something that experienced criminal investigators understand deeply. The first minutes of a crisis are unlike any other moment in an investigation. They are raw, unfiltered, before anyone has had time to organize their thoughts, rehearse their words, or decide what to say and what to leave out. And those first minutes in the Nancy Guthrie case were captured on a 911 call that has remained sealed from the public for over 100 days. Hi viewers, before going any further, there is one thing that needs to be asked. When you first heard about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, did you believe from the beginning that this case would be solved quickly, or did something about it feel off to you right away? Drop your answer in the comments below. It genuinely matters to know what people were feeling when this case first broke. 100 days. Think about what that number actually means in the context of a nationally watched investigation. In most high-profile missing persons cases, portions of the 911 audio surface within weeks, sometimes days. Investigators release fragments deliberately to generate tips, to maintain public pressure, to keep the story moving in a direction they can manage. That did not happen here. The call stayed sealed, the timeline stayed guarded, and the silence surrounding both of them only grew heavier as the weeks turned into months. Most people looking at this case from the outside interpreted that silence one way. They assumed it meant investigators were stuck, that the case had gone cold before it ever had a chance to warm up, that somewhere between the surveillance footage and the blood evidence and the ransom-style communications sent to media outlets, the trail had simply gone quiet. But that assumption may be wrong, dead wrong, because there is another explanation for why a 911 call stays sealed this long. One that experienced investigators know well, and that the public rarely considers until someone says it plainly. What if detectives went back to that audio, not because they had nothing, but because something they originally accepted as consistent suddenly wasn't? What if the call was never the problem? What if the problem was what they missed inside it? That is the question sitting at the center of everything surrounding this case right now. And the answer to it, if there is one, may explain more about why Nancy Guthrie has not been found than anything else that has surfaced in the last 100 days. Here's what is known. Nancy Guthrie is an elderly woman, a mother, a grandmother, connected to a name that millions of people across this country recognize without being told twice. The night she disappeared, she was taken from her home in the dark. Blood was found at the front door. A masked suspect appeared on surveillance footage. Communications styled like ransom demands were sent directly to media outlets. This was not an accident. This was not confusion. This was planned. Nancy Guthrie was not the kind of woman whose name was supposed to end up in a headline like this. She was elderly. She was a mother, a grandmother, the kind of person who exists at the quiet center of a family, the one everyone else orbits around without fully realizing it until she is gone. And she was connected, by blood, to a name that millions of Americans recognized. Her child had built a public life, a career visible enough that when Nancy's name surfaced in the news, it didn't stay local. It went everywhere, fast. That matters, Not because fame changes what happened to her, but because it changes the pressure surrounding every single decision made in this investigation from the very first night. When Nancy Guthrie disappeared, it was not quiet. Nothing about it was quiet. She was taken from her home in the middle of the night. Blood was discovered at the front door, not a small detail, not something investigators could explain away or set aside. Blood at a threshold means something happened there, something that left a mark before whoever was responsible moved on. A masked figure appeared on surveillance footage near the property. That detail alone shifted the entire tone of the early investigation. This was not a confused elderly woman wandering into the dark. This was a planned event. Someone had come to that house with a purpose. Someone had prepared. Someone had covered their face. And then came the communications. Ransom-style messages sent directly to media outlets, not to law enforcement, not privately to the family, to the press. That choice was deliberate. Whoever sent those communications wanted an audience. They wanted attention, pressure, and chaos, all moving in a specific direction at a specific moment. Think about that for a second. A masked suspect, blood evidence, surveillance footage, ransom-style communications going to journalists. These are not the details of a case that should have gone quiet. These are the details of a case that should have exploded with investigative activity, public tip lines, FBI press conferences, national appeals with photographs and timelines and reward announcements. None of that came. Instead, the investigation went in the opposite direction entirely. And here is where the story of Nancy Guthrie stops being just a missing persons case and starts becoming something harder to look away from. Because in the earliest hours, before the surveillance footage became public, before the blood evidence was confirmed, before federal authorities stepped in, someone made a call, a 911 call. And whatever was said in those first minutes has been locked away from public access ever since. That call was made at the beginning of everything, before the narrative formed, before anyone had time to decide what the story was going to be. And the person on that call spoke while the situation was still raw, before memory could smooth the edges, before words could be carefully chosen, before silence became a strategy. That call exists. It has always existed. And for over 100 days, not a single second of it has been released. Most people accepted that fact and moved on. Investigators have their reasons, they said. Sealed evidence is normal, they said. But normal compared to what? Because in nationally followed investigations involving vulnerable victims, blood evidence, surveillance footage, and ransom communications, audio from the initial emergency call almost always surfaces eventually, partially, selectively, enough to keep the public engaged and the pressure on. Not here. Here, the silence held completely. And that silence is not the only thing that needs a closer look. What needs a closer look is what may be sitting inside that call, something that was heard in the earliest hours of this investigation and either underestimated, misread, or quietly flagged for reasons the public has never been told. Because whoever called 911 the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared spoke before they had time to think too carefully. And sometimes that is exactly when the truth comes out. There is something most people do not fully understand about 911 calls in criminal investigations. They are not just records of what happened, they are behavioral evidence.
When someone calls 911 during a crisis situation, investigators are not only listening to the words being spoken, they're listening to behavior. They're listening to stress levels, pacing, confusion, urgency, emotional reaction. They're listening for pauses and maybe background noises in the change in the tone of the voice, the sequence of information being provided.
When investigators sit down to analyze an emergency call, they are not simply transcribing words onto a page and checking the facts against the physical evidence. They are listening to an entirely different layer of communication, one that most callers do not even realize they are producing in the moment. Stress, pacing, The rhythm of breathing between sentences, the length of pauses and exactly where those pauses fall inside a conversation, the sequence in which information is volunteered, what a caller mentions first, what they circle back to, and what they never bring up unless directly asked. All of it matters. Here is why. When a person experiences genuine shock, real, unprocessed, uncontrolled shock, their communication follows a specific pattern. Words come out fragmented, information arrives out of order, emotions interrupt the logical delivery of facts. A person in authentic crisis does not narrate events cleanly. They stumble, they repeat themselves, they say things that don't immediately make sense because their mind is processing and speaking at the same time, and the two are not fully synchronized yet. That is what real shock sounds like, and investigators are trained to recognize when that pattern is present and when it is not. There is something else they listen for: pre-event knowledge. It is one of the most telling behavioral signals in any emergency call, and it shows up in subtle ways that most people would never catch on a casual listen. Pre-event knowledge is when a caller references details about a situation that they should not yet know, or when they describe a scene with a level of specificity that doesn't match the chaos of someone discovering something for the first time. It shows up in word choice. It shows up in what is described before being asked. It shows up in what is never described at all. The details that someone genuinely traumatized would almost certainly mention, but someone managing a narrative might unconsciously skip. Investigators also listen for emotional consistency, not whether a person is crying or calm. People respond to crisis differently, and experienced investigators know better than to judge raw emotion alone. What they are listening for is whether the emotional register of the caller matches the moment they are describing, whether the urgency in the voice rises and falls in ways that feel organic, whether the fear sounds like it belongs to someone experiencing an event or someone recounting one. The difference is real, and it is detectable. Background sounds matter too. What can be heard behind the caller's voice often tells a story that the words never do. Movement, other voices, sounds that should be present in a genuine crisis and aren't, sounds that shouldn't be present at all. And then there's the sequence of information. This is perhaps the most overlooked element in public discussions about 911 calls. The order in which a caller provides information, what they lead with, what they follow with, what they withhold until asked directly, maps onto a psychological pattern that investigators spend careers learning to read. Someone discovering a crisis for the first time leads with the most immediate, visceral detail, the thing that hit them hardest, the thing their eyes landed on first. Someone managing a narrative leads with the detail that establishes the story they want investigators to accept. Those are two very different calls, and they sound different. Now apply all of that, every single filter, to a 911 call made the night an elderly woman disappeared from her home. A call that was logged, filed, sealed, and has not been released in over 100 days. A call that was reviewed in the earliest hours of the investigation when the pressure was enormous and the timeline was still being built in real time.
Investigators, they know that the first minutes after a traumatic event often reveal more than people realize because the human mind, it has not fully organized itself yet. People react naturally, before memory begins reconstructing events later. That is one reason why those early moments matter so much in criminal investigations.
What if, in those earliest hours, investigators heard the call and accepted it? What if they checked it against what they knew, and in that moment it seemed consistent? And what if, as more evidence came in, digital records, biometric data, surveillance timelines, something in that call stopped being consistent? Not loudly, not obviously, quietly, the way the most important things always do. That is the possibility now being examined, and it is why the 911 call in the Nancy Guthrie case may be far more important than anyone has publicly admitted. Here is where the analysis has to become very precise, because the claim being examined is not that the 911 call in the Nancy Guthrie case contains an obvious lie. It is not that investigators were deceived in some dramatic, cinematic way. The claim is quieter, and because of that, more serious. The claim is that something inside that call, something behavioral, something embedded in the structure of how information was delivered, may have been underweighted in the earliest review, and that as the investigation developed, as digital evidence began filling the timeline minute by minute, what initially seemed consistent may have developed small but significant fractures. Start with the timeline. From the beginning, the timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has been one of the most guarded aspects of this entire case. Investigators have not released a clear public account of when events occurred. The sequence of the night, when Nancy was last confirmed present, when the situation was first discovered, when the call was made, and what happened in between those moments, has never been laid out for public examination. That is unusual. In most investigations involving physical evidence this significant, a basic timeline gets released early. It serves a purpose. It generates tips. It allows the public to cross-reference what they may have seen or heard against a known sequence of events. Here, the timeline stayed sealed alongside the call. Now consider what investigators likely had access to within days of Nancy's disappearance. Modern digital evidence does not wait. Phones communicate with cell towers continuously. Smartwatches record movement and biometric activity automatically. Vehicles store driving data. Applications preserve location history in cloud systems that survive even when devices are turned off or destroyed.
Phones constantly communicate with towers and networks automatically. You can't stop it unless you turn the phone off. Smartwatches, they record movement and biometric activity. Vehicles, they store driving data. Applications track location history. Cloud systems preserve information that people never even realized that they created. And one thing that has fascinated so many people in this case is the discussion surrounding Nancy Guthrie's Apple Watch, pacemaker activity.
Nancy Guthrie wore an Apple Watch. That detail has circulated in public discussion of this case from early on, and it matters enormously in the context of what investigators may have been able to reconstruct about the timeline of that night. An Apple Watch connected to a pacemaker monitoring system does not simply track steps. It tracks heart rate. It tracks irregularities. It records the precise moments when physical activity changed, when the body responded to stress, when movement stopped. That data creates a timeline, a very specific minute-by-minute timeline that no human account can alter after the fact. So here is the question that sits at the intersection of all of this. If investigators had access to biometric data that told them exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie's body during those critical hours, and if that data conflicted in even small ways with the account given on the 911 call, what would they do with that information? They would not release it. They would not correct the public record. They would seal the call, guard the timeline, and go back to the beginning, quietly. And that may be exactly what happened here. The behavioral elements inside the 911 call that analysts believe deserve closer examination are not one single dramatic moment. They are a pattern. The sequence of information provided, what was mentioned before being asked, what was omitted until later, what was described with a level of specificity that didn't fully match the emotional register of the call overall. The pauses.
Then every public release becomes important. Every statement matters. Every disclosure matters. Because investigators may be trying to avoid triggering a reaction that they cannot control.
Silence in a criminal investigation is never random. That is one of the first things experienced analysts learn when they study how major cases are managed from the inside. Every decision about what to release, what to withhold, what to confirm, and what to deny is a calculated choice. especially in a case receiving the level of national attention that the Nancy Guthrie investigation has commanded since the very first night her name appeared in a headline. So when people look at the unusual restraint surrounding this case, the absence of press conferences, the lack of public tip campaigns, the sealed call, the guarded timeline, the federal involvement that produced almost no public-facing statements, the question is not whether that restraint is intentional. Of course it is intentional. The question is what it is protecting. There are several possibilities, and experienced investigators will tell you that in a case with this profile, all of them may be operating at the same time.
Sometimes they stay quiet because they're protecting witnesses. All understandable. And sometimes they stay quiet because they believe the offender is watching every public move that they make. And I believe this. That happens far more often than people realize.
The first is behavioral monitoring. When investigators believe that someone connected to a case is watching public coverage closely, tracking every statement, every release, every piece of information that surfaces, they reduce public noise deliberately. Every disclosure becomes a variable. Every statement is a signal that could trigger a response. And if that response is one investigators cannot control, the risk of releasing information outweighs the benefit of public pressure. In a case where ransom-style communications were sent directly to media outlets, where whoever was responsible deliberately inserted the press into the situation from the beginning, that possibility is not theoretical, it is operational. Second is digital evidence still being processed. Modern forensic analysis of phones, cloud systems, and biometric devices takes time, more time than the public typically expects. And investigators working with data that is still being analyzed do not release partial information that could later contradict what they eventually prove. They wait. They build the complete picture before they show any of it. If Nancy Guthrie's Apple Watch data, phone records, and any other digital evidence connected to that night are still being cross-referenced against physical and behavioral evidence, including whatever is inside the 911 call, investigators would say nothing publicly until that process was complete.
Some of the quietest investigations that I ever saw were quiet because investigators were trying very hard not to disrupt something sensitive that was happening behind the scenes.
The third possibility is the most uncomfortable one. What if the silence is not just protecting strategy, but protecting something investigators are not yet ready to act on? There are cases where investigators know with significant confidence what happened and who was responsible, but the evidence, as it currently exists, is not yet sufficient to survive the legal process that follows an arrest. In those cases, investigators do not rush. They build, they gather, they wait for the moment when what they know becomes what they can prove. And in those cases, silence is not confusion. Silence is patience. The family's restrained public communication fits inside any of these frameworks. Families in serious investigations are often advised explicitly and carefully about what to say and what to leave out. Not because they are suspected of anything, because investigators understand that in sensitive cases, cases involving digital evidence, behavioral analysis, potential ongoing monitoring by someone dangerous, controlling the information environment is part of the strategy. When people look at the family's measured public presence and interpret it as suspicious, they are often misreading something entirely different. They are seeing people following instructions. People trying to do what they have been told gives Nancy the best chance. That distinction matters enormously. And yet the question underneath all of it remains. If this investigation is this controlled, if the silence is this deliberate, this consistent, this sustained across federal and local authorities and the family and every public-facing element of this case, what is the thing at the center of it all that requires this level of management? The 911 call keeps coming back as the answer. Not because it is the only piece of evidence, but because it is the first piece, the one made before anything was decided, the one that exists in a form that cannot be altered, adjusted, or reframed after the fact. Whatever was said in those minutes is permanent, and if what was said in those minutes conflicts, even in small, behavioral, almost invisible ways, with what the digital evidence later showed to be true about that night, then the 911 call is not just evidence, it is a problem. A very specific, very carefully guarded problem that investigators have been sitting with for over 100 days. And the longer it stays sealed, the more it suggests that what is inside it is not something they missed the first time. It is something they found, something they are not yet ready for anyone else to find. Nancy Guthrie deserves to be found. But for whoever is responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie, there is something that needs to be understood very clearly. Digital evidence does not age. Biometric records do not forget. A heart rate captured by a smartwatch at 2 in the morning does not change its story because months have passed. Phone towers logged what they logged. Cloud systems preserved what they preserved. And somewhere inside all of that data, the truth about what happened that night already exists in a form that no one can go back and edit. Time does not erase forensic evidence. It only gives investigators more time to understand what it means. And the 911 call, sealed, protected, and quietly being re-examined, is sitting at the center of all of it. Whatever was said in those first minutes is permanent. Whatever behavioral signals were embedded in that call, whatever pauses fell in the wrong places, whatever information was mentioned too early or withheld too long, it was captured, it was recorded. And now, with months of additional evidence built around it, investigators are listening to it differently than they did on the first night. That is the most dangerous moment in any investigation for the person responsible. Not when the arrest happens, not when the evidence is presented in court. The most dangerous moment is when investigators go back to the beginning, back to the first call, the first words, the first unguarded minutes of a crisis, and hear something they were not ready to hear the first time. That moment may already have happened in this case. The silence that followed it would look exactly like this. To the viewers who have followed Nancy's case from the beginning, who have watched every update, read every report, and felt in their instincts that something about this investigation is not what it appears on the surface, stay close to this story. Stay close to this channel, because the next video in this series is going to go somewhere this one only pointed toward. There is a specific detail buried inside the public discussion of this case, one that connects the sealed timeline to the biometric records to the ransom communications. And when those three things are placed side by side in the right sequence, the picture they form is unlike anything that has been discussed publicly about this case so far. It is not speculation, it is pattern recognition, and it points somewhere very specific. The next video on Caleb Crime Files will be ready soon. Make sure this channel is the first thing you check when it drops, because once that detail is laid out clearly, this case will never look the same again. Nancy Guthrie's story is not over, and neither is this investigation.